We have a news story over at Dropsite News, written with my colleague Maha Husseini, that looks into the infamous reporting that the Free Press did into what they said were a dozen cases of Palestinians who they claimed had been unfairly elevated as examples of famine in Gaza. The article was titled, "They Became Symbols for Gazan Starvation, but all 12 suffer from other health problems." Now, we discovered something very strange when we first started looking into this, and we don't have to dwell on this. They don't look into 12 cases. They don't. Like, unless they did and just didn't publish it. And we asked them for comment. We have not gotten comment on this bizarre discrepancy. It doesn't fundamentally undermine their reporting by itself, but they said they were going to look into 12 cases plus the famous New York Times ones. That's 13. They only named 9. There's another one that's alluded to, so you could generously give them 10. So when we started looking closer at their reporting, we're like, wait a minute, this is deeply flimsy. However, according to Olivia Reingold, this was truly outstanding reporting. So let's roll a little bit of her from a clip that came along with their post.
So you've probably seen these photos of skeletal kids in Gaza on front pages, all over social media, even in a UNICEF ad. They've become the symbols of famine. But we decided to look into these photos and the stories behind them. And what we found is that in case after case, these kids were sick, but not just with malnutrition. In every instance, they were suffering with other conditions or illnesses like cystic fibrosis, cerebral palsy, and even traumatic head injuries.
Now, all of this is important because obviously this is not just important in its own right, and their original piece was perhaps to me one of the most infuriating I've ever seen because of how shoddy it was. It's one thing to look into, do any investigation you want, but you should also do the investigation. What we found here is that the Free Press did not, as far as we can tell, attempt to contact any of the families or the people involved in the story, which is journalism 101 is if you're going to write about somebody's health conditions, you would presumably speak to them or their doctors or somebody who has familiarity.
Which
all they did was Google Translate.
Well, I was going to say, a lot of the journalists on the ground who had used the images already, they were on the ground talking to the families. If I'm remembering correctly, for example, the New York Times pictures were taken by a photojournalist, and I think there was a journalist on the ground, and they had been in conversation with the families about the conditions.
Yeah, and so the fundamental point that the Free Press says that it's making with this investigation is that these children were held up, mostly children, there are 2 adults, held up as examples of the victims of the famine. But in fact, they had pre-existing conditions, and they exposed the fact that they have these pre-existing conditions. So what we did,
which weren't disclosed by the Washington Post, for example, and the Washington Post put up a note eventually, and I actually think
the Times added something.
And the point that you and I talked about at the time, it's actually perfectly acceptable to disclose those those pre-existing problems, and they should do that. And the reporting that you all have added and contributed to the conversation is that actually it's often people with pre-existing conditions who are the first to succumb when there are shortages of food.
Exactly. Full context is good, but the idea that these children's pre-existing conditions were the thing that was driving their health complications, which is what the Free Press pushes, that turns out not to be the case once you talk to their families. So we asked Maha to interview as many of these family members as she could. In the middle of her reporting, she was forcibly displaced from Gaza City, and she had interviewed and done reporting on 3 of the cases. And I said that you don't stop. And it's like reporting from a tent without electricity, with like intermittent access to internet, and no home base to write. It's extraordinarily difficult. And the cases that she looked into, I think, told enough of the story that we can understand what's going on here. So we can start with Muhammad Zakaria Ayub al-Mutawak, who actually is the now 22-month-old whose picture adorned the New York Times story that then created this controversy that FP and others said, this child has other health complications. So, you should not have used them as an example of the worsening, famine conditions in Gaza. So we talked to family and got from them before and after photos. So the photo you're looking at here is Muhammad 12 days before the March 2nd siege is announced in Gaza. So on March 2nd, Israel closed all the crossings. No food, no medicine, nothing allowed in. And that went deep into May. And that's what drove the acute crisis. So you can see his picture before this happened, and then you can see after. And what the FP would have you believe is that it was his pre-existing health condition. And we have a VO here that we can play too of him getting a haircut in a tent before the crossings were closed. And you can tell he's got some you can just tell. You don't even have to be a doctor. You can tell he's got some pre-existing health conditions. But it was the lack of access to food that drove his condition. Now, Muhammad obviously is going to suffer things worse than other children, but it's just very clear. Now, at the same time, it's also worth fuller context if we want it. So he was born in December 2023 during one of the nights of the fiercest bombing that they saw in the area where he was born in Gaza City. The last 2 months of her pregnancy, they were displaced and moving constantly.
Right after October 7th. Yeah,
so this is right. So, and some of the most widespread indiscriminate violence was right after October 7th. So he's born into that. And you can imagine that there could be some slight muscle weakness, which is what he had when he was born. And you can imagine some neurological conditions as well.
Totally.
The health of the mother during the pregnancy matters for children.
Yeah.
And so rather than kind of lessening the responsibility of the siege and the assault on his condition, the further reporting actually strengthened it. And so to give even more context, which I think is important, this is what his mother says. I suffered from malnutrition around 2 months after I gave birth to him, and he stopped breastfeeding. At that time, his father was still with us and could acquire milk. So despite the harsh conditions, Muhammad began growing as a healthy child. At one point, he was even chubby, and we've seen the photos to prove that that's the case. On October 28th, 2024, his father, Zachariah, was killed in an Israeli strike in Deir el-Balah. And so now his mother is caring for these 2 children under these much more difficult conditions. She writes, I couldn't consistently get milk or diapers, but people continued to support me, bringing milk from time to time. I was still able to provide food for him until the occupation sealed the borders and enforced starvation in March. Doing this reporting, in some ways I felt guilty even like asking these families to justify their situation. But at the same time, it's important to do so because the free press has now been bought by Paramount. Bari Weiss has been elevated to editor-in-chief of CBS News, and what she considers to be proper journalistic tradecraft is now going to have the backing of hundreds of budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
That's what drove me crazy about the story originally and continuously the story now that you all are following up on it. It reminds me of your report on the Douglas Murray, David Frum speech contributions to the Israeli ambassador as well, which is there's a constant drumbeat of lecturing from many of these same people about journalistic ethics. And that is exactly what happened.
With this story, they kept talking about how proud they were of this reporting that they did.
Their editorial board, their editorial, they wrote a free press editorial just slamming you, Sagar, and Crystal. I somehow escaped.
How did you get?
I don't know. But all that is to say, that was a lecture about journalistic ethics from people who were engaged in clearly lapsed journalistic ethics.
Yeah.
In the same story, with the same breath that other people were being criticized over.
Right.
And it's not a matter of like your ideological standpoint on this. Like if we set that aside, that is not the full and complete picture. The full and complete picture was not told in this counter story. And so, I think it's important that the Washington Post now includes the disclosure. I think that's good. But getting that isn't a concession. Your story was a sort of beacon, a paragon of journalistic success.
And we can quickly go through two others. So another one is 6-year-old Najwa Hussein Hajjaj. First of all, the Free Press claimed that these were all viral images. Even that is extremely dubious assertion. Najwa's photo was included in a CNN slideshow. How you define viral, I don't know. But it appears more like they just went cherry picking any image that was associated with any story about starvation and then Googled until they could find somebody who also had a health condition. I looked it up, by the way. There are more cases of child disability in Gaza before October 7th than average around the world. I think UNICEF has it at like 12%, average is 9 or 10%. So 20 to 30% higher in Gaza. And you can imagine, like, well, why would there be more childhood disability, like in Gaza, in a place that has been under siege for many decades? So using the fact that somebody has a disability against them, in this case, is further undermined by the fact that they have the disability might be related to the siege that their families have been living under for generations. But so what they found with Hajjaj is they found that she had an esophageal condition. And the Free Press suggested that this esophageal stenosis, rather than the imposed starvation, was responsible for her condition. So Maha talked to her mother, and she says, quote, "And before the war started, we had taken her to the hospital, and she was diagnosed with esophageal stenosis. Her condition had not yet worsened, and a surgery was scheduled for December 4th, 2023. Quote, "But of course, with hospitals being bombed, others overwhelmed with victims, and a lack of equipment, her surgery was canceled. This is when our own war with her condition began," unquote. Which, again, stands to reason. If you imagine in your own life, if you and your family and your entire community are overnight shut off from access to medical care, emergency departments are open if you're a victim of the bombing or you're shot, and then they can treat you. But anything scheduled, like they're working on your esophageal condition, like that's canceled.
Right.
It's just not happening. And so she started vomiting, was unable to keep things down. In the past, her mother has said the supplements and medical fluids had kept her in a stable condition despite this situation. But without those supplements and medical fluids, then she began to succumb to the ravages of malnutrition, and she was diagnosed with severe malnutrition. Quote, "We tried to secure her proper food for her condition, like pureed vegetables, yogurt, juice, or soft cheese, but none of these were available during the starvation campaign. We couldn't secure anything but lentils." And so she was then successfully evacuated, and since then has undergone 3 surgeries for this condition. But this is what all experts will tell you, that when famine hits, it is not the healthiest people who suffer the most first. It is the people who are most susceptible to that. And just think about it in your own life. If that happened, if all of a sudden you were cut off from food and medical aid, who would go down first?
Yeah.
And then imagine somebody came to you and said, well, your grandmother had this condition, so why are you blaming us?
Yeah.
Like, you're the one that cut off food and medicine. That's why I'm blaming you. It's not my grandmother was doing okay, even though she had her condition. And finally, one of the adults is Hamza Ismail Mishmish. He's a 25-year-old who'd had a lifelong pre-existing condition, which I think was obvious in the photos of him. And so his brother told DropSite, quote, "Hamza was born with cerebral palsy and congenital anomalies and had lived with this condition for years. We used to follow up with doctors, and he survived all these years on nutritional supplements and vitamins. During the war, we faced difficulties securing the nutritional supplements, and it was impossible to compensate with fresh food, with the borders closed, and even when international aid was allowed in, all we could find was canned food. But in the recent months of starvation, his condition rapidly deteriorated." And Shadi added that although his body did appear thin before the war, quote, "One can clearly see the difference between how he looked then and how he looks now. The recent starvation made us completely helpless toward his condition. Food supplements were completely unavailable." And then the part that's even more brutal to kind of think about living with these conditions, because this is difficult enough under the most comfortable conditions, living in a nice house with all the access that you can have to food and medicine. Anybody who lives with this condition or knows somebody who does, it's very difficult. But Mishmish's family added to drop site that his health has been further worsened by the family's conditions and displacement, forcing him to live in a makeshift tent after their home was bombed. Quote, "This tent cannot protect him from the scorching heat in summer or the freezing cold in winter. In cold weather, we cannot keep him warm, so his body develops infections, his feet swell, and his entire body weakens. We would need at least 3 weeks to help him recover from these symptoms. All these circumstances combined are why his body has never been the same since the war." So imagine this is your family member, and Bari Weiss and Olivia Reingold come up to you and say, it's because of his cerebral palsy that he's in this condition. Like, he's 25 years old. We've known him his whole life. The condition is because of the siege and the war. And to even make you point that out to them is a form of crazy making.
And again, it actually makes the story fuller, more interesting to know that it's the case. And so,
yeah, one of the ones they cited was a 14-year-old who had a piece of his skull removed because he was hit by an Israeli shell.
Oh my gosh!
He had a pre-existing condition from getting shelled by Israel.
Right.
It's like, this is not serious. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. You were.
No. I think it's all even more. It enriches the story to know the background, and it makes it clear just the level of the downstream effects. We talk a lot about obviously famine deaths because those are the people have actually died, but also just the downstream consequences of lack of medical treatments and food and how that affects the most vulnerable among us and has over the last couple of years. It's it's a tragedy, and it's definitely not an own or a slam dunk against the outlets that use these images.
Yeah, and we can look forward to a lot more of this, I guess, now from 60 Minutes.
We'll see. We'll see. All right. Great story, Ryan.
Thank you.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.